Hi everyone. This will just be a quick little video to address what seems to be widespread confusion about narcissism. I'm a clinical psychologist who writes about, researches, and treats pathological narcissism and related disorders. And as I've discussed in a few of my previous videos, narcissism is a very stigmatized disorder. It's extremely difficult to find any information about NPD or narcissism online that isn't extremely charged with skewed representations of narcissists as predators and abusers, and isn't also hyper-focused on a very narrow definition of the disorder that's actually extremely rare in the general population. Here's a very simple and accurate clinical definition of narcissism. It's adapted from an article that appeared in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology in preparation for the publication of the DSM-5. Narcissism is defined as the capacity to maintain a relatively positive self-image through a variety of self, affect, and field regulatory processes. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that narcissism as a clinical construct refers to a person's ability to maintain a positive, stable, and realistic self-image despite the challenges that life throws at them. Now, notice that this definition of narcissism is not about mental illness. And that's because narcissism is a broad concept in psychology, and it refers to both healthy and pathological functioning. Okay, so here's the definition of narcissism as a mental illness, something we call pathological narcissism. It's defined as difficulty maintaining a positive, realistic self-image accompanied by deficits in effective coping when threats to self-image are encountered. Now, notice I made no mention of inflated self-esteem or self-importance. Pathological narcissism is not about having too much of anything. It's not about having too much self-confidence. It's not about having too much self-regard or too much vanity. It's defined by deficits. Deficits in self-image, deficits in coping, deficits in social functioning and awareness. Now, these deficits show up in the form of two broad phenotypic expressions of pathological narcissism. The first is one that everybody's already familiar with, called narcissistic grandiosity. That's defined as dysfunction characterized by an overvalued, entitled self-image, exploitative, exhibitionistic behaviors, absorption by idealized fantasies, and other maladaptive self-enhancement strategies. Now, this is the picture of someone who has difficulty maintaining a realistic and stable self-image who compensates by adopting an inflated sense of self-importance. It's the person who has too little, but pretends they have too much. The second is one that not very many people are familiar with. It's called narcissistic vulnerability. It's defined as dysfunction that's characterized by a depleted, enfeebled self-image, angry, shameful, and depressed affects, self-criticality, suicidality, interpersonal hypersensitivity, and social withdrawal. This is the picture of a person who is depressed, ashamed, and self-critical, sometimes to the point of being suicidal. They're sensitive to feeling rejected, and they avoid social gatherings. It isn't your stereotypical picture of a narcissist. It's also important to remember that these are not different types of narcissist. All pathological narcissists fluctuate between periods of grandiosity and vulnerability. The guy who seems completely full of himself and like he has an unrealistically positive self-image likely goes through private periods of breakdown and vulnerability. The same goes for the quietly depressed narcissist who has an unrealistically negative self-image. That person likely goes through intense periods of grandiosity and inflated self-esteem. So the next time you come across a book or a video or a website stigmatizing narcissism, remember that this is a mental illness we're talking about, and one that is much more often expressed in the form of fragile self-image and chronic breakdown than a mustache-twirling social vampire. The majority of narcissists are just trying to keep a stable, realistic, and relatively positive self-image. They have a social and emotional disability. They're not monsters who are out to get anyone. Okay, thanks for listening and thanks for joining me. Take care.